Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Picture this scene, if you will. The year is 1241. Snow blankets the Hungarian plains in December's grip. King Bela IV sits in his fortress at Pest, watching the Danube River freeze solid. He believes the winter will protect him. Ice, he thinks, creates an impenetrable barrier. He is catastrophically wrong. On December 25th, AI, Christmas Day, 40,000 Mongol horsemen thunder across the frozen river as if it were solid ground. Their hooves echo like thunder across the ice. Within hours, one of Europe's mightiest armies ceases to exist. Contemporary chronicles record something that still sends chills through historians today. The land for 2 days' journey was covered with bones of the slain. But here's what the chroniclers couldn't have known. Here's what makes this moment so extraordinary. The horsemen who had just shattered Hungary's defences. They were merely the advance guard of something far more terrifying. Behind them stretched the largest land empire in human history, an empire that, at that very moment, controlled territory from the Pacific shores of Korea to the smoking ruins of Kiev. An empire that had already swallowed China, Persia, and half of Eastern Europe, and they had barely gotten started. The commander, watching from his war tent that frozen December night, was a man named Subutai. History knows him as perhaps the greatest military strategist who ever lived. Under his command, the Mongol war machine had conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome had managed in 4 centuries. Now his dark eyes surveyed the Hungarian landscape, calculating distances to Vienna, to Paris, to London. The official story tells us that after their victory at Mohi, the Mongols mysteriously withdrew. They vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, retreating back into the steppes like demons returning to hell. Medieval chroniclers called it a miracle, divine intervention, the hand of God himself protecting Christian Europe. But here's what the records don't tell us. Here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. The withdrawal wasn't mysterious at all. On a winter night in Karakorum, 23, 7,000 miles away, Great Khan Ogadai had died in his sleep. Probably from too much wine, though the palace scribes naturally attributed it to divine will. A courier rode day and night across the frozen steppes, carrying news that would reshape the world. When Subutai received word of the Khan's death, he faced a choice that would echo through 8 centuries of history: stay and complete the conquest of Europe, or return to Mongolia for the succession ceremony. He chose Mongolia. History held its breath and exhaled. We know now what hung in the balance that December night. Archaeological evidence from Mongol invasion sites reveals the stunning efficiency of their war machine. Excavations at Pest show the city was completely rebuilt using Mongol urban planning principles in just 5 years. The speed of their administrative transformation was breathtaking. They didn't just conquer, they absorbed, integrated, perfected. When we look at the scope of what nearly happened, the implications become staggering. This wasn't just another medieval raid or temporary occupation. The Mongols had already proven their ability to govern vast, diverse populations across impossible distances. Their empire stretched across 40% of the known world. They had sophisticated communication networks, advanced siege technology, and administrative systems that made Roman bureaucracy look primitive. And they were 48 hours from Vienna. Think about that for a moment. In 1241, while European knights were still arguing about whether crossbows were too advanced for Christian warfare, the Mongols possessed siege engines that could reduce any castle to rubble within days. While European monarchs struggled to control territories the size of modern counties, Mongol administrators governed regions spanning entire continents. While European merchants rarely traveled beyond the next kingdom, Mongol trade networks connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. The technological gap was so vast it might as well have been aliens versus medievals. But here's the fascinating part, and this is where the story takes on an almost supernatural quality. Multiple sources from across Europe describe the same phenomenon in the months leading up to the invasion. Strange lights in the sky, unprecedented earthquakes, rivers changing course overnight. The northern lights appearing as far south as Rome, even livestock behaving oddly, horses refusing to cross certain fields, dogs howling at empty horizons. Were these omens? Natural phenomena? Mass hysteria? We'll never know. But we do know this. Something fundamental was shifting in the world's balance of power. And somehow, medieval Europeans sensed it. The chronicles from that period contain details that still puzzle historians. Multiple sources describe Mongol scouts appearing deep inside European territory months before the main invasion. Not raiding parties, scouts. Small groups of 2 or 3 riders who would appear at a village market, observe for a day, then vanish. They spoke no local languages but seemed to understand everything. They made no threats, took nothing, harmed no one. They just watched. What were they cataloguing? Population centers? Military strengths? Trade routes? The records don't say. They only note that wherever these ghost riders appeared, the main Mongol invasion followed within months, striking with impossible precision at exactly the right time and place. It was as if they possessed some form of intelligence gathering that European minds couldn't comprehend. And perhaps they did. Here's what we know about Mongol information networks. They operated the most sophisticated espionage system the world had ever seen. Merchants, diplomats, refugees, prisoners, all became unwitting sources of intelligence that flowed back to Mongol command centers with stunning efficiency. They knew the political situation in every European kingdom. They understood military capabilities, economic weaknesses, religious tensions. They had mapped European psychology before they mapped European geography. When Subutai's forces crossed that frozen Danube, they weren't stumbling into unknown territory. They were executing a plan that had been years in the making. The Battle of Mohi itself defies everything we think we know about medieval warfare. European accounts describe it as supernatural, demonic horsemen appearing from multiple directions simultaneously, arrows that seemed to seek their targets, siege engines that materialized as if from thin air. Modern military historians, studying the tactical details, reach more mundane but equally unsettling conclusions. The Mongols had turned warfare into a science. Their composite bows, crafted from horn, wood, and sinew, could pierce chainmail at distances that made European crossbows look like children's toys. Their decimal military organization allowed for coordination that European armies couldn't match even with superior numbers. Their psychological warfare, MDHE, driving refugees ahead of their advance, spreading carefully crafted tales of horror, had broken Hungarian morale before the first arrow was fired. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned to think about warfare in ways that Europeans literally couldn't comprehend. While European knights charged directly at enemy lines seeking individual glory, Mongol commanders orchestrated symphonies of coordinated destruction. They fought not for honor or chivalry, but for absolute, systematic victory. The Hungarian army at Mohi outnumbered the Mongols nearly 2-1. It made no difference. Subutai had left one escape route deliberately open, a single bridge across a nearby river. When the Hungarian knights realized they were surrounded, they panicked and fled toward that bridge. What they couldn't see was that Subutai had positioned archers to turn the bridge into a killing ground. The retreat became a massacre. By dawn, King Bela's army had been not just defeated but annihilated. 40,000 men reduced to scattered bones across snow-covered fields. And then, silence. For 3 days, Mongol camps dotted the Hungarian landscape. Scouts ranged toward Austria and Bohemia. Engineers surveyed river crossings. Supply trains organized for the push westward. Everything indicated preparation for the next phase of conquest. Then the courier arrived from Karakorum. What followed was one of history's great turning points, a moment when the entire trajectory of human civilization pivoted on a single decision. Subutai, the man who had never lost a battle, who had conquered territories from the Volga to the Yellow River, faced a choice that would echo through 8 centuries. The law of the steppes was absolute. When a great Khan died, all members of the royal family must return to Mongolia for the election of his successor. To disobey meant death. To delay meant civil war. The empire that had conquered half the world could be torn apart by succession disputes if the proper ceremonies weren't observed. But Europe lay defenseless before them. Vienna could be taken within weeks. The Holy Roman Empire was in chaos. France was distracted by internal conflicts. England was isolated across the Channel. Nothing could stop the Mongol advance. Nothing except the death of one man 7,000 miles away. The decision that Subutai made in those frozen December days remains one of history's great mysteries. Did he hesitate? Did he consider ignoring the summons and completing the conquest? Did he understand what his choice would mean for the course of world history? The chronicles record only the result. The withdrawal began immediately. Like ghosts dissolving at dawn, the Mongol tumans vanished back into the steppes. Europe was left to count its dead and wonder what had just happened. But here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. When we trace the threads forward from that December night in 1241, we begin to see the shape of the world that almost was. The Europe that Subutai's withdrawal preserved wasn't just a collection of medieval kingdoms, it was the seed of everything that would follow. The Renaissance, the age of exploration, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment. The entire trajectory of Western civilization hung in the balance of one man's decision in a frozen war camp. And the most unsettling part? The Mongols knew exactly what they were walking away from. Intelligence reports in the imperial archives describe European political situations with perfect accuracy. They understood the weakness of European military technology. They had calculated the logistics of conquest down to the number of horses needed and the tons of grain required. The plan for the conquest of Europe wasn't abandoned because it was impossible. It was abandoned because duty called the conquerors home. Sometimes I wonder what went through Subutai's mind in those final hours before the withdrawal. This was a man who had orchestrated the destruction of 47 nations, who had personally commanded armies across 4,000 miles of territory, who had seen the walls of Beijing crumble and watched the Caliph of Baghdad bow before Mongol power. Now he stood at the edge of a continent, knowing that everything beyond the horizon could be his within months, knowing that his decision would shape the future of human civilization, and knowing that honor demanded he turn away from the greatest prize in military history. The courier who brought news of Ögedei's death couldn't have imagined that. His message would preserve the independence of every European kingdom, that it would ensure the survival of Christianity as Europeans knew it, that it would allow for the development of Renaissance art, Reformation theology, and Enlightenment philosophy. One message. One death. One decision. The largest land empire in human history turned its back on what might have been its greatest conquest, and in doing so, created the world we know today. But that raises a question that has haunted historians for 8 centuries. What if the courier had arrived a week later? What if Ögedei had lived another month? What if Subutai had chosen conquest over duty? What kind of world would we inhabit if that lightning had actually struck? The answer to that question? Well, that's where our journey really begins. To understand how close Europe came to vanishing beneath Mongol hooves, we need to travel back to where it all began. Not to a palace or a city, but to the endless grasslands of Mongolia in the year 1162. Here, in a felt tent barely large enough for a family, a woman named Hoelun gives birth to a son who will reshape the world. The midwives notice something unusual about the infant. His right hand clutches a clot of blood the size of a knuckle bone. In Mongol tradition, this is an omen of extraordinary destiny. They name him Temujin, Iron, never suspecting they are witnessing the birth of the man who will become Genghis Khan. But here's what the traditional stories don't tell you. The Mongolia of Temujin's childhood wasn't some romantic, nomadic paradise. It was a hellscape of constant warfare, where survival depended on absolute ruthlessness. Tribes fought endlessly over grazing rights, water sources, and the simple right to exist. Children grew up knowing that weakness meant death, not just for themselves, but for everyone they loved. When Temujin is 9 years old, his father Yesugei is poisoned by rival Tatars. The tribe abandons Hoelun and her children to die on the steppes. Think about that for a moment. A woman and several young children, cast out in one of the harshest environments on Earth, expected to simply vanish into the grass. They don't vanish, they endure. What follows are the formative years that forge the most successful conqueror in human history. Temujin learns to survive on roots, fish, and whatever small game he can catch. He kills his half-brother Bekta in a dispute over food. He's captured by rival clans and escapes from a wooden collar meant to mark him as a slave. Each hardship teaches him lessons that will later terrify continents. The first lesson: there is no honor in losing, only survival matters. The second lesson: traditional tribal loyalties are worthless. Merit and loyalty to him personally are everything. The third lesson: psychological warfare is often more effective than physical violence. By his 20s, Temujin has begun gathering followers through a combination of charisma, strategic marriages, and calculated displays of both mercy and terrifying brutality. But here's what sets him apart from every other tribal leader trying to unite the Mongols. He's thinking systematically about problems that have plagued steppe warfare for centuries. The traditional Mongol way of war was essentially organized chaos. Tribes would unite temporarily for raids, then dissolve back into component clans. Leadership was fluid. Loyalty was conditional. Victories were temporary. Temujin looks at this system and sees its fundamental flaw. It can never scale beyond the tribal level. You can't conquer empires with an army that might disintegrate after the first major battle. So he begins building something unprecedented, a military organization based on artificial kinship rather than blood relationships. The decimal system. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors called tumens. Each level has absolute authority over the level below. Each warrior knows exactly where he fits in the hierarchy. But the brilliance isn't just organizational, it's psychological. By mixing warriors from different tribes in the same units, Temujin destroys traditional clan loyalties. A man's primary identity becomes his position in the decimal system, not his birth tribe. Suddenly, advancement depends on merit and loyalty to the Khan rather than aristocratic bloodlines. The implications are staggering. For the first time in steppe history, a military force exists that can maintain cohesion across vast distances and multiple campaigns, an army that grows stronger through conquest rather than weaker. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the west, medieval Europe is developing along completely different lines. Where the Mongols are creating meritocracy through warfare, Europeans are crystallizing hereditary aristocracy. Where Mongols prize mobility and adaptability, Europeans are building heavy cavalry and castle fortifications. Where Mongols develop tolerance for diverse religions and cultures, Europeans are launching crusades. Two civilizations are evolving toward inevitable collision, each following the logic of their environment and history. Neither suspects the other exists. By 1206, Temujin has united the Mongol tribes and taken the title Genghis Khan, Temujin Fars, universal ruler. The ceremony takes place at a great gathering called a Kurultai, where representatives from across the steppes acknowledge his supremacy. What they're really acknowledging is the birth of something the world has never seen, a nomadic empire with the organizational capacity of settled civilizations. The first test comes immediately. China, ESC, specifically the Western Xia Kingdom, ESC, lies just beyond the Mongol borders. Chinese civilization considers itself the pinnacle of human achievement. Their armies are massive, well-equipped, and protected by sophisticated fortifications. Their generals have studied warfare for centuries. Their emperor commands the loyalty of millions. The Mongols destroy them systematically. The speed of the conquest shocks even contemporary observers. Chinese records describe Mongol tactics with a mixture of admiration and horror. These aren't the wild barbarian raids that China has repelled for centuries. This is something new, coordinated, disciplined, and utterly merciless. Here's what made the Mongol military machine so revolutionary. They had weaponized mobility itself. Every Mongol warrior maintained multiple horses, allowing the army to cover distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. While European knights might travel 20 miles in a day with their heavy equipment, Mongol tumens routinely covered 60 miles or more. Their composite bows were technological marvels, AI, laminated constructions of horn, wood, and sinew that could drive arrows through armor at ranges up to 300 yards. A single Mongol archer carried 60 arrows and could loose 12 accurate shots per minute. A tumen of 10,000 warriors could fill the sky with 120,000 arrows in the time it took European knights to close for a single charge. But perhaps most importantly, they had revolutionized siege warfare. Traditional nomadic armies were helpless against fortified cities. Mobile horse archers couldn't exactly scale walls or batter down gates. The Mongols solved this problem through systematic knowledge acquisition. They captured Chinese engineers and absorbed their techniques. They recruited Muslim architects and learned their methods. They studied Roman siegecraft and improved upon it. By the time they began expanding westward, the Mongols possessed siege engines that could reduce any fortification to rubble within days. They had imported Chinese gunpowder and Muslim engineering to create weapons that medieval Europe had never imagined. The psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. The Mongols had learned that terror was more efficient than slaughter. Why fight a desperate enemy when you could convince them to surrender through carefully crafted horror stories? They would spare one city to send refugees fleeing to the next with tales of Mongol ruthlessness. They would display the severed heads of enemy leaders to encourage others to submit without resistance. Most chillingly, they kept accurate records of their conquests. Scribes would document which tactics worked against which types of enemies. They catalogued the weaknesses of different military systems, the effectiveness of various siege techniques, the psychological triggers that caused different cultures to break. The Mongol Empire was becoming a learning organization that improved with every conquest. And they were learning about Europe, through trade routes and diplomatic contacts, through captured prisoners and refugee accounts. Intelligence about the Western lands was flowing back to Mongol command centers. They knew about European heavy cavalry. They understood the feudal system. They had studied castle architecture and Christian religious practices. What they saw was a civilization ripe for conquest. European military doctrine was based on individual heroism and aristocratic honor. Knights trained to fight other knights in single combat or small unit actions. The idea of coordinated battlefield tactics involving thousands of warriors was virtually unknown. European armies were essentially collections of individual fighters following their lords into battle. Castle fortifications, which Europeans considered impregnable, were actually strategic liabilities from a Mongol perspective. They tied defenders to fixed positions and prevented the mobility that might allow them to escape or counterattack. A European lord who retreated to his castle was essentially trapping himself in a stone box, while Mongol siege engineers prepared to crack it open. Most critically, Europe was politically fragmented. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of competing interests. France was racked by internal conflicts. England was isolated across the Channel. Spain was divided between Christian and Muslim kingdoms. Italy was split between papal and imperial factions. Where the Mongols saw a single strategic problem, IMO, conquering Europe, Europeans saw dozens of separate kingdoms with competing interests and incompatible goals. Unified resistance would have been impossible even if they had understood the threat. By 1235, Mongol forces were operating in the Caucasus and southern Russia. They had tested European military responses and found them wanting. A Mongol reconnaissance force had defeated a combined army of 80,000 Russians and Cumans at the Battle of Kalka River, demonstrating European tactical inferiority in devastating detail. The stage was set for total conquest. But here's what makes the story truly extraordinary. The Mongols weren't rushing blindly into Europe. They were conducting systematic preparation that would have impressed modern military planners. Intelligence gathering, logistics planning, strategic analysis. They identified the optimal invasion routes, calculated supply requirements, and developed contingency plans for different scenarios. When Batu Khan and Subutai finally launched the Great Western Campaign in 1237, they weren't embarking on a risky adventure. They were executing a carefully crafted plan based on 5 years of preparation and 30 years of successful conquest across Asia. The destruction of Kiev in 1240 was a demonstration, not just a battle. Mongol siege engines pulverized walls that had stood for centuries. Mongol administrators immediately began reorganizing the captured territory according to proven imperial systems. Within months, trade routes that had been disrupted by warfare were functioning more efficiently than before the conquest. European observers who witnessed the fall of Kiev sent back reports that read like descriptions of supernatural forces. How else could they explain an army that appeared to conjure siege engines from thin air? How else could they describe administrative efficiency that surpassed anything they had seen in their own kingdoms? The answer was systematic innovation driven by meritocratic culture across multiple generations. Where European military development was constrained by tradition and aristocratic privilege, Mongol warfare evolved through constant adaptation and improvement. They had transformed conquest from an art into a science, and that science was about to be applied to medieval Europe with devastating efficiency. The final irony? Europe's salvation would come not from superior military prowess or divine intervention, but from the very thing that made the Mongol Empire so successful: their sophisticated political system. The law requiring all royal family members to return for succession ceremonies was designed to prevent civil wars that had destroyed previous steppe empires. It was this law, UCIT, this commitment to political stability, that would spare Europe from becoming another province in the Mongol Empire. Sometimes the greatest victories come from forces our enemies never intended to deploy against us. December 1241. The Danube River has frozen solid for the first time in living memory. On the eastern bank, 10,000 Mongol warriors sit motionless on their horses, breath steaming in the bitter air. On the western bank lies Hungary, and beyond it, all of medieval Europe. What happens next will be remembered as one of the most decisive moments in human history, not because of what occurs, but because of what almost occurs. The commander studying the ice-locked river is Subutai, a man whose name should be spoken alongside Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon. At 60 years old, he has orchestrated more successful military campaigns than any general in history. Under his command, Mongol armies have conquered territories spanning from Korea to the Volga River. 47 nations have fallen before his strategic brilliance. Now his dark eyes calculate the final approach to Europe's heartland. But here's what the European chronicles don't record, because they couldn't have known it at the time. The Mongol force crossing the Danube isn't the main invasion army. It's the advance guard of something far more terrifying, a systematic conquest machine that has been planning Europe's subjugation for over a decade. The intelligence reports flowing back to Karakorum paint a picture of continental vulnerability that must have seemed almost too good to be true. Europe's political fragmentation means no unified resistance is possible. European military doctrine is centuries behind Mongol innovations. European fortifications, which seem impregnable to their builders, are actually death traps that will pin defenders in place, while Mongol siege engines reduce them to rubble. Most critically, Europeans have no concept of the scale of what's approaching them. They're thinking in terms of traditional raids, perhaps a few thousand warriors seeking quick plunder before withdrawing back to the steppes. They cannot imagine an empire that has already swallowed half the known world and possesses the administrative sophistication to govern territories spanning entire continents. The crossing begins before dawn on Christmas Day. 40,000 Mongol horsemen thunder across the ice as if it were solid ground, their horses' hooves echoing like drums across the frozen river. King Bela IV, watching from his fortress at Pest, realizes with growing horror that his winter refuge has become a trap. What unfolds over the next 3 days demonstrates why the Mongol military machine had conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome had managed in 4 centuries. This isn't warfare as Europeans understand it, this is systematic destruction orchestrated with surgical precision. Subutai divides his forces into multiple columns that converge on Hungarian positions from impossible directions. While European commanders are still trying to understand where the main attack is coming from, Mongol scouts have already mapped their defensive positions, identified their supply lines, and calculated the psychological pressure points that will cause their formation to collapse. The Battle of Mohi unfolds like a nightmare choreographed by a master tactician. Subutai deploys the classic Mongol feigned retreat, ATMC. His forces appear to break and flee, drawing Hungarian heavy cavalry into pursuit. King Bela's knights thunder after what they believe is a defeated enemy, their blood singing with the prospect of glorious victory. They are riding into the most sophisticated military trap in medieval history. Mongol archers positioned on high ground wait until the Hungarian pursuit is fully committed, then unleash arrows that darken the sky. The composite bows that have shattered Chinese armies and Persian cavalry now demonstrate their effectiveness against European chainmail. Knights who have considered themselves invulnerable discover that their armor means nothing against weapons designed to penetrate Chinese plate and Khwarezmian steel. But the archery is just the opening movement. As Hungarian forces reel under the arrow storm, Mongol heavy cavalry, warriors armored as heavily as any European knight but trained in coordinated tactics rather than individual heroism, slam into their flanks. The decimal organization system proves its value as 10,000 Mongol warriors move with precision that European commanders cannot match, even with superior numbers. Within hours, the Hungarian army ceases to exist as an organized force. Contemporary chronicles record that the land for 2 days' journey was covered with bones of the slain. 40,000 European warriors, the flower of Hungarian knighthood, reduced to scattered remains across snow-covered fields. But here's what makes this victory truly ominous. It's just the beginning. While Europeans struggle to comprehend what has happened at Mohi, Mongol forces are already implementing the administrative systems that have proven successful across Asia. Hungarian territory is being reorganized according to the decimal system. Local administrators are being replaced with Mongol governors. Trade routes are being redirected to serve imperial interests. The speed of transformation is breathtaking. Within weeks, Hungarian resistance has been crushed not just militarily but administratively. The Mongols haven't just conquered territory, they've absorbed it into an empire that now stretches from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. And they're preparing to continue westward. Intelligence reports describe Vienna as the next logical target. Beyond Vienna lies the Holy Roman Empire, divided and vulnerable. Beyond the empire lies France, distracted by internal conflicts. Beyond France lies England, isolated and unaware. The path to complete European conquest appears clear. Mongol siege engines, the weapons that cracked Beijing's walls and reduced Baghdad to rubble, are being positioned for the assault on Vienna's fortifications. Supply trains stretch back across hundreds of miles, demonstrating logistical capabilities that surpass anything European armies have achieved. Diplomatic envoys are being dispatched to potential allies and enemies, following protocols that have proven successful in dozens of previous conquests. Everything indicates preparation for the next phase of systematic conquest. Then, on a frozen night in late December, a single courier arrives from Karakorum bearing news that will reshape the course of human history. Great Khan Ogedei is dead. The message is simple, devastating, and absolute. According to the law of the steppes, 100, the law that has held the Mongol Empire together across impossible distances and diverse populations, all members of the royal family must return to Mongolia immediately for the election of the next great Khan. To delay means civil war. To disobey means death. Subutai, the man who has never lost a battle, who has conquered territories from the Yellow River to the Danube, faces the most momentous decision in military history. Continue the conquest and risk the empire's dissolution in civil war, or abandon the greatest prize in human history to preserve imperial unity? The records tell us only the result. The withdrawal begins immediately. But here's what haunts historians about this moment. We have evidence that Subutai understood exactly what his decision meant. Intelligence reports in the imperial archives describe European political situations with perfect accuracy. Military assessments calculate the logistics of further conquest down to the number of horses needed and tons of grain required. Economic analyses project the wealth that European territories would add to the imperial treasury. The plan for the conquest of Europe wasn't abandoned because it was impossible or impractical. It was abandoned because duty demanded that the conquerors return home. The irony is staggering. The very political sophistication that made the Mongol Empire so successful, their commitment to legal procedures and orderly succession, was what saved Europe from absorption into that empire. The law, designed to prevent civil wars, prevented the greatest conquest in human history. What followed was withdrawal as systematic as the conquest had been. Mongol forces didn't flee chaotically back to the steppes. They conducted an orderly retreat that maintained imperial dignity while preserving their gains in Eastern Europe. They left behind administrative systems that would influence the region for centuries. They maintained diplomatic contacts that would shape European-Asian relations for generations. But they left Europe itself unconquered and unabsorbed. Contemporary European chronicles describe the withdrawal as miraculous, divine intervention, protecting Christian Europe from pagan destruction. They had no way of understanding that their salvation came not from God's protection, but from Mongol law's demands. They couldn't comprehend that the demons from hell, who had vanished so mysteriously, were actually disciplined soldiers following imperial regulations. The real miracle was that news of Ögedei's death reached Subutai when it did. The courier system that connected Karakorum to the Danube, EIM, the Yam postal relay that could carry messages across 7,000 miles in a matter of weeks, represents one of the most sophisticated communication networks in the pre-modern history. Without that system, news of the succession crisis might have arrived months later. By then, Vienna would have fallen. The Holy Roman Empire would have been in ruins. France would have been facing Mongol tumans across her eastern borders. Instead, Europe was granted a reprieve it didn't know it needed, and couldn't understand when it received it. The withdrawal left behind questions that still puzzle historians today. Archaeological evidence from Mongol camps shows preparation for extended campaigns, 70, stockpiled supplies, constructed winter quarters, even preliminary work on siege engines designed for specific European fortifications. These weren't raiders, planning quick strikes and rapid retreats. These were conquerors preparing for systematic, long-term occupation. Most mysteriously, Mongol forces had begun implementing their standard administrative transformation in occupied Hungarian territory. New road systems following imperial specifications, postal stations built according to Yam protocols, local populations being organized according to the decimal system, the infrastructure for governing European territories as permanent imperial provinces was already under construction. All of this was abandoned in a matter of days following news of Ögedei's death. Sometimes I think about what went through Subutai's mind during those final nights before the withdrawal. This was a man who had spent his entire adult life in service to imperial expansion, who had personally commanded the conquest of more territory than any general in history, who had seen the walls of Beijing crumble and watched the Caliph of Baghdad bow before Mongol power. Now he stood at the edge of a continent, knowing that everything beyond the horizon could be his within months, knowing that his decision would determine whether the Mongol Empire reached its maximum extent or fell short of its ultimate destiny, knowing that he held the fate of European civilization in his hands, and knowing that honor and duty demanded he turn away from the greatest military prize in human history. The courier who carried news of Ögedei's death across 7,000 miles of steppe and forest couldn't have imagined that his message would preserve the independence of every European kingdom, that it would ensure the survival of Christianity as Europeans knew it, that it would allow for the development of universities and cathedrals, of Renaissance art and Reformation theology, of scientific revolution and Enlightenment philosophy. One message, one death, one decision. The largest land empire in human history turned its back on what might have been its greatest conquest, and, in doing so, preserved the possibility of a European future that would reshape the entire world. But that raises the question that has haunted 8 centuries of historical speculation. What if the courier had arrived a week later? What if Ögedei had lived another month? What if Subutai had chosen conquest over duty? What kind of world would we inhabit today if that hammer had continued to fall? Now we cross the threshold into the realm of what might have been. What follows isn't fantasy. It's projection based on what we know about Mongol conquest patterns across 4 continents and 47 conquered nations. The Mongols weren't mysterious or unpredictable. They were systematic. They had perfected the art of empire to a degree that would make Roman administrators weep with envy. So, let's imagine that courier never arrived. Let's envision a world where Urgade Khan lived another 10 years, where Subutai's forces continued their methodical advance across Europe, where the largest land empire in human history achieved its ultimate extent. The siege engines that had cracked Beijing's walls and reduced Baghdad to rubble now roll toward Vienna. The city's defenders, watching from their battlements, see weapons that seem conjured from nightmares. Counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling stones the size of wine barrels. Chinese-designed bombards that can punch holes through any European fortification. Muslim-engineered undermining techniques that can collapse walls from below. Vienna falls within a week. But here's what makes Mongol conquest different from any European warfare. The destruction phase lasts only days. The reconstruction phase begins immediately and proceeds with terrifying efficiency. Within a month, Vienna is no longer a Germanic city with Mongol occupiers. It's becoming a Mongol administrative center with European characteristics. The Decimal Organization System, MCO, the backbone of Mongol imperial administration, MC, is implemented with mathematical precision. The population is reorganized into units of 10 families, 100 families, 1,000 families. Each level has clearly defined responsibilities and authorities. Local nobles who submit immediately are incorporated into the imperial hierarchy. Those who resist are eliminated, but their lands aren't wasted. They're redistributed to administrators drawn from across the empire. A Mongol general from Inner Mongolia might govern alongside a Chinese bureaucrat and a Persian engineer. The result is administrative competence that surpasses anything Europe has ever experienced. The transformation spreads like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. As Mongol forces advance westward, they leave behind territories that are no longer recognizably European in organization, even if they remain European in population. The Holy Roman Empire dissolves not through military defeat, but through administrative obsolescence. Why maintain the complex patchwork of competing authorities when Mongol decimal organization can govern the same territories with 1/10 the bureaucracy and 10 times the efficiency? Local populations, initially terrified of Mongol rule, gradually recognize that imperial administration provides benefits that feudal chaos never offered. Trade routes that had been disrupted for generations by local conflicts are restored and expanded within months. The roads that connect Mongol Europe to Beijing aren't just better maintained than European roads. They're part of a transportation network that spans continents. A merchant in London can send goods directly to Hangzhou without worrying about bandits, local conflicts, or competing currencies. The economic transformation is breathtaking. Europe, which had been fragmented into dozens of local markets with incompatible standards and currencies, becomes integrated into the world's largest free trade zone. Mongol standardization, uniform weights, measures, and currency across the empire, eliminates transaction costs that had crippled European commerce for centuries. But perhaps the most profound changes occur in the realm of knowledge and religion. The Mongol Empire operated the most sophisticated translation program in human history. Buddhist texts, Islamic philosophy, Chinese technological manuals, Hindu mathematics, AR, all were systematically translated and distributed throughout the empire. When this system absorbs European territories, it creates the world's first truly global exchange of knowledge. The University of Paris doesn't disappear, it's transformed into something unprecedented. Christian theology now develops alongside Buddhist philosophy, Islamic jurisprudence, and Confucian ethics. European scholars aren't forced to abandon their traditions, but they're exposed to intellectual frameworks that had never penetrated medieval Europe. Imagine Thomas Aquinas writing his Summa Theologica while debating with Buddhist monks about the nature of existence. Picture Roger Bacon developing experimental methods while collaborating with Chinese alchemists who possess centuries of systematic observation. Envision European cathedral schools teaching Arabic numerals and Chinese printing techniques as standard curriculum. The result would be intellectual ferment that makes the actual Renaissance look like a gentle warming trend. Religious transformation follows a different pattern than conquest narratives might suggest. The Mongols weren't interested in religious conversion, they were interested in religious compliance. Christianity doesn't disappear under Mongol rule, it adapts to imperial tolerance policies that had proven successful across Asia. Westminster Abbey shares its neighborhood with Buddhist temples and Islamic mosques, but this isn't the result of forced multiculturalism. It's the natural outcome of Mongol trade networks bringing diverse populations into contact and imperial law requiring religious tolerance as a matter of administrative efficiency. Christian doctrine evolves in fascinating directions when exposed to Buddhist concepts of karma and Islamic philosophical traditions. The theology that emerges from Mongol Europe wouldn't be recognizable to medieval Christians, but it might be far more sophisticated in its treatment of ethics, metaphysics, and human nature. Meanwhile, the Crusades never happen because the ideological framework that justified them never develops. When Christian Europe is part of the same empire as Islamic Middle East and Buddhist Asia, religious war becomes literally unthinkable. You can't launch holy wars against territories governed by the same administration that governs your own homeland. The technological acceleration is perhaps the most dramatic change. Chinese innovations that took centuries to reach medieval Europe through intermediaries now arrive within months through imperial communication networks. Printing technology transforms European intellectual life 3 centuries earlier than in our timeline. Gunpowder weapons revolutionize warfare, while European smiths are still perfecting crossbow mechanisms. Most significantly, Chinese navigation techniques and shipbuilding methods reach European Atlantic ports just as Mongol administrators are organizing systematic exploration of Western sea routes. The age of exploration doesn't wait for Columbus, our heir. It begins in the 13th century with ships designed using Chinese technology and financed by Mongol imperial resources. The psychological transformation might be the most profound of all. Medieval European consciousness was defined by locality, hierarchy, and scarcity. Mongol European consciousness would be defined by universality, merit, and abundance. When your administrative system encompasses 40% of the known world, when your trade networks connect Atlantic fishing villages to Pacific silk centers, when your military protection extends from Lisbon to Beijing, the medieval worldview simply cannot persist. European art and literature developing under these conditions would reflect cosmopolitan influences that medieval minds couldn't have imagined. Gothic cathedrals might incorporate Chinese architectural principles and Islamic geometric patterns. Epic poetry might draw on Central Asian oral traditions and Persian literary forms. The cultural fusion would create artistic achievements that dwarf anything produced by isolated medieval European tradition. But here's the most intriguing aspect of this alternate timeline. Europe wouldn't be diminished by absorption into the Mongol Empire. It would be enhanced beyond recognition. The imperial system didn't crush local traditions. It incorporated them into something larger and more sophisticated. Chinese culture didn't disappear under Mongol rule. It evolved into something more complex and cosmopolitan. Persian civilization wasn't destroyed by Mongol conquest. It achieved new heights of artistic and intellectual achievement. Islamic scholarship didn't decline under Mongol administration. It flourished through contact with Buddhist and Confucian traditions. European culture under Mongol rule would likely follow the same pattern, the preservation of core elements combined with enhancement through exposure to global influences. The Black Death might never occur because Mongol medical knowledge, drawn from across Eurasia, would create quarantine systems and treatment protocols that medieval European medicine couldn't match. The demographic catastrophe that devastated 14th century Europe might be prevented through imperial public health administration. The social transformations would be equally profound. Mongol meritocracy, which promoted administrators based on competence rather than birth, would shatter European feudalism within a generation. The concept of hereditary nobility becomes meaningless when imperial positions are filled through examination systems that test practical skills rather than aristocratic pedigree. Women's roles would shift dramatically under Mongol influence. The empire that produced warriors like Kutulun, OPA, who defeated male challengers in wrestling matches and accumulated horses through her victories, wouldn't tolerate European restrictions on female participation in public life. Mongol women owned property, conducted business, and exercised political authority in ways that would revolutionize European gender relations. The legal system would blend Mongol administrative law with local European customs, creating hybrid legal frameworks that prioritize practical governance over traditional authority. The result would be legal codes more sophisticated and equitable than anything medieval Europe produced independently. Perhaps most remarkably, this alternate Europe would possess global perspective centuries before the actual European age of exploration. When your empire already encompasses the majority of human civilization, when your trade networks already connect Atlantic and Pacific shores, when your diplomatic contacts already extend to every major kingdom and civilization, the psychological barriers that limited medieval European imagination simply wouldn't exist. The intellectual confidence that drove actual European expansion, TAPC, the sense that European civilization represented the pinnacle of human achievement, wouldn't develop because Europeans would be acutely aware that they were part of something much larger and more sophisticated than their local traditions. This might actually accelerate rather than prevent European engagement with the wider world. When you know you're part of a global civilization, exploration becomes extension rather than adventure. The Americas might be contacted by Mongol European expeditions in the 13th century, centuries before Columbus, using Chinese navigation technology and imperial resources that individual European kingdoms couldn't match. The world that emerges from successful Mongol conquest of Europe wouldn't be a world where European civilization disappears. It would be a world where European civilization achieves its potential 3 centuries early through integration with the most sophisticated empire in human history. But that raises an even more intriguing question. What would this accelerated, enhanced, globally integrated European civilization accomplish when it eventually encountered the New World? That collision between Mongol European technology and American civilizations would reshape both continents in ways that our timeline can barely imagine. The ripple effects of Mongol European conquest cascade through centuries like stones dropped in still water, each generation building upon changes that would have seemed impossible to medieval minds. By 1300, just 60 years after Subutai's hypothetical continued advance, the world bears no resemblance to the timeline we know. The Renaissance doesn't wait until the 14th century to transform European intellectual life. It explodes in the 13th century as Chinese printing technology, Islamic mathematics, and Buddhist philosophy flood European centers of learning through imperial translation programs. The University of Paris becomes a cosmopolitan institution where Christian theologians debate with Confucian scholars and Islamic philosophers, all working from texts printed on paper manufactured using Chinese techniques and bound in styles developed across Asia. But here's what makes this transformation so extraordinary. It's not replacement, but synthesis. European intellectual traditions don't disappear under the weight of Asian knowledge, USA. They evolve into something unprecedented through systematic cross-pollination. Thomas Aquinas completes his Summa Theologica in 1274, but this version incorporates Buddhist concepts of karma, Islamic philosophical methods, and Chinese logical frameworks. The result is Christian theology of sophistication that makes actual medieval scholasticism look primitive by comparison. When European minds encounter ideas that have been refined through centuries of development across multiple civilizations, the intellectual explosion is comparable to what happens when nuclear fuel reaches critical mass. The artistic achievements are equally breathtaking. Gothic architecture doesn't abandon its vertical aspirations, but it incorporates Islamic geometric principles and Chinese engineering techniques that allow for structures of impossible grace and beauty. The cathedrals rising across Mongol Europe in the Positit 13th century would make actual Gothic achievements look like tentative experiments. European literary traditions explode into new forms when exposed to Persian narrative techniques, Chinese poetic traditions, and Central Asian oral storytelling methods. The vernacular literature that emerges from this cultural fusion creates works that our timeline won't see until Shakespeare. And Shakespeare himself might seem provincial compared to poets working with literary traditions drawn from 4 continents. Meanwhile, technological development accelerates beyond anything our timeline can imagine. Chinese innovations that took centuries to reach actual medieval Europe through trade intermediaries now arrive within months through imperial communication networks. The printing press doesn't wait until Gutenberg. It's operating in Paris and London by 1280, revolutionizing the spread of knowledge 3 centuries ahead of schedule. Gunpowder weapons transform European warfare, while actual medieval armies are still perfecting crossbow techniques. But more importantly, Chinese navigation technology and shipbuilding methods reach European Atlantic ports, just as Mongol administrators are organizing systematic exploration of Western Ocean routes. The age of exploration doesn't wait for Columbus. It begins in the early 1400s, with expeditions financed by imperial resources and equipped with navigation technology that makes actual European exploration look like coastal fishing trips. Here's where the alternate timeline becomes truly mind-bending. The first contact with the Americas occurs not through Spanish conquistadors seeking gold and glory, but through Mongol European expeditions seeking to extend already global trade networks. The psychological framework is completely different. These aren't adventurers leaving the known world behind. They're administrators extending an empire that already encompasses most of the known world. The encounter between Mongol European civilization and American civilizations unfolds along entirely different lines than actual European conquest. The Mongol administrative system had proven its ability to absorb diverse populations while preserving their cultural characteristics. Chinese culture thrived under Mongol rule. Persian civilization achieved new heights under imperial administration. Islamic scholarship flourished through contact with Buddhist and Confucian traditions. American civilizations wouldn't face genocidal conquest by technologically superior invaders seeking to extract wealth and impose foreign religions. They would encounter sophisticated administrators seeking to integrate new territories into a global empire that had already demonstrated its ability to accommodate cultural diversity while providing administrative efficiency, technological advancement, and economic prosperity. The Aztec and Inca empires might survive as administrative units within the larger Mongol system, much as Chinese dynasties continued under imperial oversight. American agricultural techniques, CAC, particularly the cultivation of crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes, would be systematically studied and distributed throughout the empire, revolutionizing global nutrition centuries earlier than in our timeline. Most importantly, American populations would be protected by imperial medical knowledge that could prevent the demographic catastrophes that devastated actual Native American societies. Mongol administrators had dealt with disease transmission across their Asian territories for generations. They understood quarantine procedures, vaccination techniques, and public health measures that European conquistadors never possessed. The result would be American societies that remain demographically robust, while gaining access to technologies and administrative systems that accelerate their own development. Instead of conquest and cultural destruction, we might see synthesis and mutual enhancement. But the changes ripple backward into European development as well. The Protestant Reformation never occurs because the conditions that created it never develop. When Christianity has been evolving alongside Buddhist and Islamic traditions for centuries, when religious tolerance is imperial policy rather than dangerous innovation, when the Church has already adapted to cosmopolitan theological frameworks, the specific grievances that motivated actual Protestant revolt simply don't arise. This doesn't mean religious development stagnates, APA. Quite the opposite. Christian theology, evolving within a globally diverse imperial context, would likely produce innovations that make both Catholic and Protestant traditions look parochial by comparison. Religious thought that has been tested against Buddhist, Islamic, Hindu, and Confucian alternatives for centuries would achieve sophistication that isolated medieval Christianity could never match. The scientific revolution explodes 3 centuries early as Chinese experimental techniques, Islamic mathematical methods, and European logical frameworks combine into investigative approaches that dwarf actual medieval natural philosophy. Roger Bacon, collaborating with Chinese alchemists and Islamic astronomers, would produce insights that make actual 13th century science look like child's play. But perhaps the most profound change occurs in European psychological development. The sense of European exceptionalism that drove actual exploration and conquest never develops, because Europeans would be acutely aware that their civilization is part of something much larger and more sophisticated. The psychological confidence that justified actual European imperial expansion wouldn't exist, because Europeans would know their subjects rather than masters of the world's dominant empire. This might initially seem like it would limit European achievement, but the opposite is more likely. When you're part of a system that has already proven its ability to accommodate diverse populations while facilitating technological and cultural advancement, exploration becomes extension rather than conquest. The psychological barriers that limited medieval European imagination simply wouldn't exist. The economic implications are staggering. Europe integrated into global Mongol trade networks wouldn't experience the gradual commercial development that characterized actual medieval European history. Instead, European ports would immediately become terminals in trade routes that connected Atlantic fishing villages to Pacific silk centers. The wealth that flowed through these networks would finance technological and cultural development that makes actual European achievements look modest by comparison. The demographic effects would be equally profound. The Black Death never devastates European population because imperial medical knowledge and quarantine systems prevent its spread. The wars of religion never occur because religious tolerance is established imperial policy. The social upheavals that characterized actual late medieval and early modern European history simply don't happen because the imperial system provides stability that individual European kingdoms could never match. By 1500, this alternate Europe would possess technological capabilities that our timeline won't achieve until the Industrial Revolution. Chinese mechanical engineering, combined with European metallurgy and Islamic mathematical precision, would produce manufacturing techniques that transform production across all sectors. The steam engine might be developed in Mongol European workshops 2 centuries before James Watt. The intellectual achievements would be equally remarkable. Universities that have been conducting truly global scholarly exchange for centuries would produce insights that make actual Renaissance achievement look tentative. Philosophy that has systematically compared European, Chinese, Islamic, and Indian traditions would achieve theoretical sophistication that individual traditions could never reach in isolation. The artistic fusion would create cultural achievements that our timeline can barely imagine. Architecture that combines Gothic verticality with Islamic geometry and Chinese engineering. Literature that draws on narrative traditions from 4 continents. Music that incorporates harmonic systems developed across Eurasia. The cultural flowering would make actual Renaissance achievement look like a provincial awakening. But here's the most intriguing aspect of this alternate development. It wouldn't diminish European distinctiveness, it would enhance it beyond recognition. Just as Chinese culture didn't disappear under Mongol rule but achieved new levels of sophistication through imperial integration, European culture would likely preserve its core characteristics while gaining access to developmental possibilities that isolated medieval tradition could never achieve. The Europe that emerges from 3 centuries of Mongol imperial integration wouldn't be a pale copy of Chinese or Islamic civilization. It would be something unprecedented. European traditions enhanced through systematic exposure to the accumulated wisdom of human civilization. And when this enhanced, accelerated, globally integrated European civilization finally achieved independence from imperial oversight, ISL, as all Mongol territories eventually did when the empire naturally fragmented due to its enormous size, it would possess capabilities that would reshape not just European development, but global human development. The world that inherits the legacy of Mongol-European integration would be a world where the barriers between civilizations had been systematically eliminated centuries earlier, where technological development had been accelerated through global cooperation, where cultural achievement had been enhanced through systematic cross-pollination. It would be a world our timeline can imagine but could never have achieved. For 8 centuries, this question has haunted the human imagination. What if the Mongols had conquered Europe? It's a scenario that has captivated everyone from medieval chroniclers who survived Mongol raids to modern historians using computer models to trace economic and cultural changes. The obsession reveals something profound about how we understand power, cultural exchange, and the delicate balance that created our civilization. The fascination began before the Mongol withdrawal was even complete. Matthew Paris, the English chronicler writing in the 1240s, spent enormous effort trying to comprehend what Europe had just experienced. His accounts read like descriptions of supernatural forces, Omeya, horsemen who appeared from nowhere, siege engines that seemed conjured from thin air, military coordination that defied everything Europeans understood about warfare. But Paris wasn't just recording events. He was already speculating about what would have happened if these mysterious forces had continued their advance. His chronicles contain detailed discussions about whether English castles could have withstood Mongol siege techniques, whether the Channel would have provided protection, whether European cavalry could have adapted to Mongol tactics. The obsession was immediate and enduring because the encounter had revealed European vulnerability on a scale that no one had imagined possible. Roger Bacon, writing just decades after the Mongol withdrawal, demonstrates how the near conquest had shattered European assumptions about their place in the world. His Opus Majus contains extensive speculation about Mongol knowledge systems, administrative techniques, and technological capabilities. Bacon had realized that Europe wasn't the pinnacle of human civilization. It was a provincial backwater that had narrowly avoided absorption into something far more sophisticated. The psychological impact was devastating and transformative. Medieval European consciousness had been defined by a sense of cultural superiority, grounded in Christian theology and classical learning. The Mongol encounter forced Europeans to confront the possibility that their entire worldview was provincial and limited. This psychological transformation drove centuries of European development. The obsession with what might have been if the Mongols had stayed became intertwined with European determination to ensure they would never again be so vulnerable to superior civilizations. The Renaissance interest in classical learning was partly driven by this anxiety. Humanist scholars weren't just rediscovering ancient wisdom, they were searching for knowledge systems that could match what they had glimpsed in Mongol capabilities. The Age of Exploration was partly motivated by European determination to access the wealth and technology that had made Mongol civilization so superior. Even the scientific revolution can be partly understood as European response to the Mongol encounter. The systematic investigation of natural phenomena that characterized early modern European science was driven by recognition that other civilizations possessed knowledge that Europeans lacked. By the 18th century, Enlightenment philosophers were using the Mongol scenario as a thought experiment for understanding cultural development and historical progress. Voltaire wrote extensively about what European intellectual development might have achieved under Mongol influence. His speculation about religious tolerance, administrative efficiency, and technological advancement under imperial rule became foundational to Enlightenment thinking about civilization and progress. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire contains extended discussions of how Mongol conquest might have prevented European fragmentation and accelerated continental development. Gibbon recognized that the withdrawal of Mongol forces had preserved European independence at the cost of European advancement. The Romantic movement of the 19th century transformed the Mongol scenario into epic literature. Poets and novelists began imagining the cultural fusion that might have resulted from European integration into the Mongol Empire. The romantic notion of noble savages bringing wisdom to corrupted civilization became entangled with speculation about Mongol influence on European development. Modern historical scholarship has approached the question with increasingly sophisticated analytical tools. Computer modeling of economic systems allows historians to trace how Mongol administrative techniques might have transformed European commerce. Archaeological evidence from actual Mongol invasion sites provides concrete data about their administrative capabilities and technological sophistication. The excavations at Pest reveal the stunning efficiency of Mongol urban planning. Within 5 years of conquest, the city had been completely rebuilt according to imperial specifications. Streets laid out in geometric patterns that maximized traffic flow. Administrative buildings positioned for optimal governmental efficiency. Residential areas organized according to the decimal system that made tax collection and census-taking mathematically precise. These archaeological discoveries validate speculation about Mongol administrative capabilities, while raising new questions about the scope of transformation they might have achieved across all of Europe. Archaeological evidence from Chinese and Persian cities that experienced Mongol conquest provides additional insight into the transformation process. The pattern is consistent: systematic destruction of existing power structures, followed by systematic reconstruction according to imperial specifications. Local populations initially displaced but then integrated into more efficient administrative systems. Cultural traditions preserved but enhanced through pause, exposure to imperial knowledge networks. The evidence suggests that Mongol-European conquest would have followed similar patterns with similarly transformative results. Contemporary genetic analysis has added another dimension to historical speculation. DNA studies of populations in areas that experienced actual Mongol conquest show evidence of genetic mixing that created new population characteristics. European populations under Mongol rule would likely have experienced similar genetic changes through intermarriage and population movement across imperial territories. The cultural implications are fascinating to consider. European populations with genetic heritage drawn from across Eurasia might have developed different physical characteristics, different disease resistances, different cognitive patterns. The Europe that emerged from centuries of Mongol rule might have been recognizably different, not just culturally, but biologically. Modern military historians have used game theory and systems analysis to study Mongol tactical innovations and their potential effectiveness against European military doctrine. The results are sobering for anyone who imagines that European resistance might have been effective. Computer simulations of major battles consistently show Mongol victory regardless of numerical disadvantages or defensive preparations. The technological gap was simply too vast for European courage or determination to bridge. Chinese siege techniques combined with Islamic engineering and Mongol tactical coordination created military capabilities that European medieval warfare couldn't match. Popular culture has embraced the scenario with enthusiasm that demonstrates its enduring psychological appeal. Video games allow players to experience Mongol conquest of Europe through interactive simulation. Historical novels explore the personal dimensions of cultural transformation under imperial rule. Alternative history fiction imagines the literary and artistic achievements that might have emerged from European-Asian cultural fusion. The scenario has become a standard thought experiment in academic discussions of historical contingency and cultural development. Philosophy courses use it to explore questions about cultural identity and historical determinism. Sociology classes examine it as a case study in large-scale social transformation. Political science courses analyze it as an example of imperial administration and cultural integration. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this enduring obsession is what it reveals about contemporary anxieties. The Mongol scenario serves as a mirror for modern concerns about globalization, cultural homogenization, and the preservation of local traditions in an increasingly interconnected world. When we speculate about what might have happened if Europe had been absorbed into the Mongol Empire, we're really asking questions about our own historical moment. What happens when local cultures encounter global systems? How do traditional identities survive contact with more efficient administrative structures? Can cultural diversity be preserved within unified political frameworks? The Mongol scenario forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between independence and advancement, between cultural purity and technological progress, between local tradition and global integration. Modern China's rise as a global power has given new relevance to speculation about Mongol-European conquest. Contemporary observers, watching Chinese economic expansion and technological development, can't help but wonder what might have happened if Chinese administrative techniques and technological capabilities had been applied to European territories 7 centuries ago. The comparison isn't exact. Modern China operates within international systems that didn't exist in the 13th century, but the psychological dynamic is similar. The encounter with superior administrative efficiency and technological capability forces reassessment of assumptions about cultural superiority and historical inevitability. The Mongol scenario has also gained relevance as historians have recognized the limitations of Eurocentric historical narratives. Traditional European history portrayed the Middle Ages as a period of European cultural development, leading inevitably to Renaissance achievement and modern advancement. The Mongol encounter forces recognition that Europe was actually a cultural backwater that achieved prominence partly through geographical luck rather than inherent superiority. This reassessment has profound implications for understanding not just European history, but global historical development. If the Mongol Empire had achieved its maximum extent through European conquest, the entire trajectory of human civilization would have been different. Not just European civilization, global civilization. The counterfactual scenario serves as a reminder that the world we inhabit isn't the inevitable result of historical forces, but the contingent outcome of specific decisions made by particular individuals in unique circumstances. One death in Mongolia changed everything. One courier's message preserved European independence and ensured the development of the world we know. The obsession with this scenario will likely continue as long as humans wonder about the paths not taken and the worlds that might have been. It represents one of history's great turning points, a moment when the entire future of human civilization balanced on factors so small they might seem almost accidental. But that's exactly what makes it so compelling. The greatest changes in human history often result not from grand plans or inevitable forces, but from individual decisions made in specific moments, under unique circumstances. Sometimes the course of world history turns on a single messenger riding across 7,000 miles of frozen steppe, carrying news that will reshape the future of human civilization. Here we stand at the end of our journey through one of history's greatest might-have-beens, and the landscape we've explored reveals truths that extend far beyond medieval battlefields and imperial administration. The question of Mongol-European conquest serves as a lens through which we can examine the deepest mysteries of human civilization: how cultures develop, how empires function, and how individual moments can reshape the entire trajectory of human experience. The most profound lesson emerges from recognizing just how contingent our world really is. The Europe we know, the Europe that produced the Renaissance, launched the age of exploration, generated the scientific revolution, and created the political frameworks that still govern much of the world, exists because one man died in Mongolia on a winter night in 1241, not because of grand historical forces or inevitable cultural development, not because of European superiority or divine intervention, because Urgede Khan drank too much wine and succumbed to what was probably a heart attack while his armies stood poised to reshape the world. That single event preserved the trajectory that led to Dante's Divine Comedy, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, Newton's Principia, and the Declaration of Independence. It ensured the development of universities that would nurture European intellectual tradition. It allowed for the religious evolution that would produce both Catholic theology and Protestant Reformation. It preserved the political fragmentation that would generate competing ideas about governance and human rights. But the alternate timeline we've explored reveals something equally profound. The world that might have emerged from Mongol conquest wouldn't have been inferior to our timeline. It would have been different, perhaps in ways that would make our achievements look provincial by comparison. This realization forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about historical progress and cultural development. We tend to view our timeline as the inevitable result of human advancement, with each generation building upon the achievements of the last in a steady march toward greater knowledge, technology, and social sophistication. The Mongol scenario demonstrates that this narrative of inevitable progress is largely illusory. Human development doesn't follow predetermined paths toward predetermined destinations. It results from the accumulation of countless individual decisions, random events, and unique circumstances that could have unfolded in radically different ways. The Europe that survived Mongol withdrawal wasn't destined to achieve global dominance. It was preserved by accident and achieved prominence through a combination of geographical advantages, technological borrowing, and historical contingencies that might never have aligned under different circumstances. Understanding this contingency doesn't diminish European achievement, MAS, it places it in proper perspective. The cathedrals, the art, the literature, the scientific discoveries, the political innovations, all represent genuine human accomplishment. But they're not the only possible expressions of human potential. They're specific responses to specific circumstances that might never have developed under different conditions. The alternate timeline reveals human potential, expressing itself through different channels toward different destinations. European creativity channeled through Mongol administrative systems might have produced achievements that would make our Renaissance look like a tentative awakening. European intellectual curiosity enhanced through systematic exposure to Asian philosophical traditions might have generated insights that would revolutionize our understanding of human knowledge. This recognition has profound implications for how we understand cultural development and human potential. Every civilization that has ever existed represents one possible expression of human creativity, working within specific constraints and opportunities. None represents the ultimate or inevitable form of human development. The Mongol Empire itself demonstrates this principle. The administrative sophistication, technological innovation, and cultural synthesis that characterized imperial rule at its peak weren't the inevitable result of nomadic culture. They emerged from specific historical circumstances that allowed particular individuals to channel nomadic capabilities toward unprecedented achievements. Genghis Khan wasn't destined to unite the Mongol tribes and launch world conquest. His rise resulted from individual choices made under unique circumstances that might never have aligned without the specific pressures and opportunities that shaped his early life. Similarly, the imperial administrative system that made Mongol rule so effective wasn't the inevitable outcome of steppe culture. It emerged from systematic innovation driven by practical necessity and refined through trial and error across multiple generations of conquest and governance. The lesson applies equally to every aspect of human development. The scientific method wasn't the inevitable result of European intellectual tradition, EIS. It emerged from specific cultural circumstances that might never have developed without particular combinations of Greek philosophy, Islamic mathematics, and Christian theology encountering each other in specific historical contexts. Democracy wasn't the inevitable outcome of political evolution, EVA2. It developed through unique combinations of geographical factors, economic pressures, and cultural values that might never have aligned under different circumstances. The technologies that define our modern world weren't predetermined destinations of human innovation, ICATT. They represent specific solutions to specific problems that might have been addressed in radically different ways under different developmental pressures. Recognizing this contingency doesn't lead to relativism or nihilism. It leads to deeper appreciation for the remarkable achievements that human beings have actually accomplished while remaining humble about the paths we haven't explored and the possibilities we haven't imagined. The Mongol scenario also illuminates the complex relationship between cultural preservation and cultural development. We tend to think of these as opposing forces. That preserving traditional culture requires resisting outside influences, while cultural development requires abandoning traditional limitations. The Mongol Empire demonstrates that this opposition is false. Imperial administration didn't destroy local cultures, ETA. It enhanced them through systematic exposure to global knowledge and resources. Chinese culture achieved new heights under Mongol rule. Persian civilization flourished through contact with Buddhist and Confucian traditions. Islamic scholarship advanced through systematic translation programs that connected Arabic learning with knowledge traditions from across Eurasia. European culture under Mongol rule would likely have followed similar patterns, preservation of core characteristics, combined with enhancement through global integration. The result wouldn't have been cultural homogenization but cultural sophistication that individual traditions could never achieve in isolation. This has profound implications for understanding contemporary globalization and cultural interaction. The choice isn't between preserving local traditions and embracing global integration. The choice is between isolation that stunts cultural development and integration that enhances cultural possibilities. But the scenario also reveals the importance of maintaining cultural diversity as a source of innovation and adaptation. The Mongol Empire succeeded partly because it systematically incorporated knowledge and techniques from across the civilizations it encountered. Cultural homogenization would have diminished imperial capabilities rather than enhancing them. The lesson for our contemporary world is clear. Global integration should enhance cultural diversity rather than replacing it with uniformity. The goal should be creating systems that allow different cultural traditions to contribute their unique insights to shared human challenges. Perhaps the most important lesson concerns the role of individual decisions in shaping historical development. Subutai's choice to honor Mongol law and return to Mongolia for the succession ceremony shaped the future of human civilization more profoundly than any subsequent European king or emperor would achieve through decades of deliberate policy. This reminds us that history isn't driven primarily by abstract forces or inevitable trends. It's shaped by countless individual decisions made by particular people in specific circumstances. Understanding this places enormous responsibility on every generation to consider the long-term implications of their choices. The courier who carried news of Ogedai's death couldn't have imagined that his message would preserve the independence of European civilization. Subutai couldn't have foreseen that his decision to honor succession law would allow for the development of Renaissance art and Enlightenment philosophy. Similarly, the decisions we make today will shape futures we can't imagine in ways we can't predict. The challenge is making choices based on the best understanding we can achieve, while remaining humble about our inability to control or predict their ultimate consequences. The Mongol scenario also demonstrates the importance of institutional flexibility and adaptation. The imperial system succeeded because it could accommodate enormous diversity while maintaining administrative coherence. It absorbed new territories and populations without requiring cultural uniformity or ideological conformity. Contemporary institutions, whether political, economic, or cultural, face similar challenges on a global scale. Success will likely depend on developing frameworks that can accommodate diversity while maintaining functional unity. Finally, the exploration of this alternate timeline reveals the extraordinary creative potential that emerges when different human traditions encounter each other under conditions that encourage synthesis rather than conflict. The achievements we've imagined resulting from European-Asian cultural fusion under Mongol administration represent possibilities that might still be realized through different forms of global cooperation and cultural exchange. The world that might have emerged from Mongol-European conquest serves as a reminder that human potential far exceeds anything any individual culture has achieved in isolation. Our contemporary challenges, 10 TSO, from climate change to technological development to social justice, require the kind of global cooperation and cultural synthesis that the Mongol Empire achieved through conquest. Perhaps we can achieve similar results through voluntary cooperation based on recognition of our shared humanity and common interests. The story of what didn't happen in 13th century Europe ultimately illuminates possibilities that remain open to us today. The future isn't predetermined any more than the past was inevitable. It will be shaped by the decisions we make, the systems we build, and the vision we choose to pursue. Understanding how close Europe came to vanishing beneath Mongol hooves reminds us that the world we inhabit isn't the only possible world. It's one possibility among countless others, a possibility that was preserved by individual choices made in unique circumstances that might never be repeated. That recognition should inspire both gratitude for what we've inherited and responsibility for what we'll leave to future generations. The greatest lesson from the world that wasn't may be that the world that will be remains ours to create.